It was a warm spring afternoon, the kind of day when the sun lingers just a little longer in the sky and kids fill the streets with laughter and the sound of bike tires on pavement. Ethan, a curious and playful 6-year-old boy with bright eyes and an infectious smile, had just finished his after-school snack. He begged his mom for a few extra minutes outside to enjoy the beautiful weather, and she agreed, watching him run out the front door with his favorite red ball tucked under his arm. Their neighborhood was quiet and close-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and children played freely without much worry. Ethan often liked to kick his ball around the yard or wander just a few houses down to visit his friend's porch, always staying within sight or sound of home. That day, nothing seemed unusual. His mother continued tidying up in the kitchen, occasionally glancing out the window to check on him. She remembered hearing the faint thump of the ball hitting the ground, followed by silence, not the kind that raises alarm, but just long enough to catch her attention. She stepped outside, expecting to see Ethan crouched over, examining a bug or poking around in the bushes, as he often did. But he wasn't there. The yard was empty. The ball was gone. Puzzled but not immediately worried, she called his name. Once, twice, louder the third time, still no answer. She walked around to the back of the house, checked the driveway, even peeked over the fence into the neighbor's yard. Nothing. A strange tightness began to grow in her chest, a quiet panic whispering that something wasn't right. Within minutes, she was on the phone with her husband, her voice trembling. Neighbors joined in the search. They combed the sidewalks, peeked into sheds, called out through the streets. But as the sun began to dip behind the rooftops and the light faded from the sky, it became heartbreakingly clear, Ethan was gone. Just like that, in broad daylight, from a safe neighborhood, without a sound. As the first few minutes of Ethan's disappearance turned into hours, a growing sense of dread settled over the entire neighborhood. What began as a mother's worried call for her son quickly escalated into a full-blown search. Neighbors who had just returned home from work dropped everything to help. They walked up and down the street, calling Ethan's name, checking behind trees, under porches, and inside unlocked garages. His father rushed home from his job across town, barely able to keep the car on the road, heart pounding with fear. He arrived to flashing police lights, a group of officers already canvassing the area, and his wife standing on the front lawn in shock, tears streaming down her face. The initial police report was taken within the first hour. Officers questioned every neighbor, searched nearby parks and alleyways, and brought in tracking dogs. A helicopter flew overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the quiet streets. But there were no signs of struggle. No screams had been heard. No suspicious vehicles had been seen leaving the area. It was as if Ethan had simply vanished into thin air. That night, his bedroom remained untouched, toys still scattered on the floor, his tiny shoes still by the door, but the house felt unbearably empty. In the days that followed, flyers were printed and plastered across town. Ethan's face appeared on telephone poles, convenience store windows, and local news broadcasts. Tips poured in from the public, a child seen at a bus stop, someone matching his description in a park, but each lead quickly fizzled out. None brought them any closer to finding him. Search parties ventured farther out into the woods and along nearby rivers, driven by hope and desperation. But day after day, they returned. Empty-handed. The community was shaken. Parents held their children closer. Strangers locked their doors in the middle of the day. Rumors started to swirl. Had Ethan wandered off? Was he taken? Could someone they knew be involved? Fear crept in like a slow-moving fog, heavy and hard to shake. For Ethan's parents, life became a blur of police interviews, media appearances, and sleepless nights spent staring at the front door, hoping it would open with their little boy standing there, safe and smiling. But that moment never came. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's name slowly began to fade from the headlines, replaced by other stories and other tragedies. The once daily updates from the local news became weekly summaries, then occasional mentions, and eventually, silence. For the outside world, it was just another unsolved case, a boy who had disappeared without a trace. But for his parents, time didn't move the same way. Every tick of the clock was a cruel reminder that their son was still gone, and they had no answers. The missing posters that once lined the streets curled at the edges, weathered by rain and wind, ignored by passers-by who had already moved on. Ethan's room remained untouched. His parents couldn't bring themselves to pack away his toys or change the sheets on his bed. His favorite stuffed dinosaur still sat propped on the pillow, just as he'd left it. Each day, his mother would sit on the edge of the bed, clutching one of his small t-shirts, breathing in what little scent remained. His father, once a lively and outgoing man, became withdrawn and quiet. The laughter that used to fill their home had vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Detectives continued their investigation, but over time, their visits became less frequent. Leads dried up. The case went cold. Despite all efforts, there were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no physical evidence to follow. It was as if Ethan had been erased from the world in a single, silent moment. The lack of closure was unbearable, not knowing whether he was alive or dead, whether he was suffering or safe, whether he remembered them or thought they had stopped looking for him. Family and friends tried to support them, but even well-meaning words began to sting. "You have to move on," some said gently, not understanding that parents never stop hoping, never stop searching. Every unknown child's face in a crowd brought a fleeting rush of hope, only to be crushed by disappointment. Every knock at the door sparked a moment of irrational optimism. Holidays were especially painful. Each birthday without Ethan was a cruel milestone, each Christmas morning a hollow celebration without his laughter echoing through the house. Though the world turned and people carried on, Ethan's parents remained trapped in that single day, the day their son vanished while playing outside. And as each year passed with no new answers, their hope became quieter, not gone, but worn down. Still, deep inside, a flicker remained. A small, stubborn belief that someday, somehow, they would find him. Though nearly a decade had passed, Ethan's father never truly accepted the silence. He had learned to live alongside the pain, to function with a broken heart and an empty chair at the dinner table, but he never stopped searching. While others gently urged him to find closure, he refused. Every day he woke up with the same thoughts running through his mind: where is Ethan? What happened to my son? What haven't I looked at yet? He had gone over every detail of that day hundreds of times, analyzing the timeline, revisiting neighbors, replaying conversations, and retracing steps with the desperate precision of a man clinging to a lifeline. He kept binders full of notes, maps, reports, and theories, some logical, others far-fetched, but all part of his refusal to give up. His garage, once filled with tools and sports gear, had slowly transformed into a makeshift war room, covered in cork boards with strings connecting clues, photographs of the neighborhood, and timelines spanning years. His obsession drove a wedge into relationships, strained friendships, and left little room for anything else, but he didn't care. People grieved in different ways, and this was his. Searching was all he had. He would revisit the neighborhood regularly, not just out of routine, but because it gave him a sense of control. He often walked the same paths Ethan used to run along, sometimes sitting on the porch steps where his son had last been seen, staring out at the street, wondering what he had missed. Every creak of a fence, every sound from a backyard still made him turn his head. He knew it sounded irrational after so many years, but he could never shake the feeling that something was off, that someone nearby still knew more than they had ever let on. Sometimes he would drive for hours, chasing down anonymous tips or vague dreams that had stuck in his mind. On occasion, he would visit nearby shelters, clinics, even youth centers, places that might take in a lost boy, just in case Ethan had somehow ended up there. He'd grown used to disappointment, but he never let it harden him. What others called denial, he called instinct. And one day, that instinct pulled him in a direction he had never fully explored before, just a few houses away from his own, where an odd, nagging suspicion had lingered all these years. A neighbor with a large property, a history of keeping to himself, and something about his backyard that always felt strange. Ethan's father had passed it hundreds of times, but that particular day, something made him stop. Something made him walk up to the fence, eyes locking on the old dog kennel sitting crooked in the corner of the yard. And for the first time in 8 years, he didn't look away. He leaned in closer, heart pounding, the air growing thick with a terrible kind of knowing, as if something deep inside him was screaming that the answers he had searched for might finally be there, just beneath the surface. That morning had started like any other. Ethan's father had gotten up early, sipped his coffee in silence, and stared out the window, the way he often did when the house was still and the weight of memory pressed down the hardest. But something felt different. He couldn't explain it, maybe it was a dream he couldn't quite remember or just a heaviness in his chest that refused to go away. As the hours ticked by, he found himself drawn to the past again, flipping through old photos and reading old police reports like he had done 1,000 times before. But this time, his eyes kept returning to a name in one of the reports, a neighbor who had been interviewed briefly during the first few days after Ethan vanished. That neighbor had always been quiet, polite but distant. He lived 3 houses down, owned a large lot with a rusted-out shed and an aging dog kennel in the corner. People in the neighborhood mostly left him alone. He kept to himself, didn't talk much, and while there was never anything overtly suspicious, there had always been something off. Back during the initial search, the man had said he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Officers had walked the perimeter of his yard, asked a few questions, and moved on. There had been no cause for suspicion, at least, not back then. But now, years later, that same dog kennel was still there, crooked and unkempt, leaning into the shadows of the property's edge. It hadn't moved in all this time, and no dogs had been seen there in years. Something about it bothered Ethan's father more than ever before. Acting on a mix of desperation and instinct, he decided to take a closer look. He walked the short distance to the property, his heart thudding in his chest as he approached the fence. The backyard looked deserted, but the air felt unusually still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. He lingered near the kennel, watching it. The structure was falling apart, wood rotted, the gate barely hanging on its hinges. A foul, musty smell seemed to hang in the air. He crouched down and peered underneath. The ground beneath the kennel was uneven, with patches of disturbed soil. His eyes narrowed. Why would the ground under an old, unused dog kennel look freshly shifted? His breath caught in his throat. Unable to fight the urge, he climbed over the fence and crept toward the kennel. He crouched down again, reached out, and began to pull away some of the debris. Bits of torn tarp, rotted wood, and piles of dead leaves came loose easily. As he cleared more of the space, he noticed something odd, the corner of what looked like a man-made structure beneath the soil. It was too square, too clean, too out of place to be natural. With shaking hands, he dug deeper, his fingernails scraping dirt and stone away. Then, he found it, something solid, metallic. A trapdoor, a hatch. He couldn't tell, but his stomach dropped. In that moment, he didn't need confirmation. He knew, somehow, instinctively, that he was standing on the edge of a dark truth that had been buried just steps from his home for nearly a decade. The backyard was no longer just part of a neighbor's property, it was a potential graveyard of secrets, and he had just uncovered the beginning. As Ethan's father crouched there beside the old kennel, the midday sun casting long shadows across the overgrown backyard, his mind raced. His hands, now caked in dirt, trembled as they hovered above the strange metallic surface he'd uncovered. It looked like a hatch, square, rusted, with a faint seam outlining its edges. The kind of thing you wouldn't expect to find buried beneath an old dog enclosure. He stared at it, frozen, as a chilling realization began to crawl over him. All those years of searching, questioning, doubting his own sanity, and now, beneath this forgotten corner of a neighbor's yard, he may have finally found something. His instinct screamed to open it, to tear it free right then and there, but fear held him still. What if he was wrong? What if there was nothing beneath it? Worse, what if there was? What if this hidden door led to a truth so terrible, he wasn't ready to face it? The air around him felt thick and heavy, as if the ground itself was resisting, unwilling to release what it held inside. A sudden gust of wind rattled the nearby trees, sending a shower of dry leaves across the backyard like whispers from the past. He stood up and backed away slowly, trying to collect himself. He knew he couldn't do this alone, not without help, and certainly not without law enforcement. But he also knew that after 8 long years of dead ends and false hope, he needed to make sure someone finally listened. This was different. This felt different. So, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. His voice cracked as he spoke to the dispatcher, carefully explaining what he had found, trying not to let his emotions take over. The operator remained calm, but her tone changed slightly when he mentioned the name, Ethan, the missing boy. A pause followed. Then a promise: officers were on the way. While he waited, he didn't move far. He kept his eyes locked on that kennel, afraid that if he looked away, whatever secret was buried beneath it might vanish again, swallowed by time and neglect. He thought about all the times he had passed this very spot, how close he had been to the truth. How many nights he had tortured himself wondering if he had missed something, if he had failed his son. And now here he was, within feet of an answer that had hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence, growing louder as they approached. Minutes later, patrol cars pulled up to the curb, followed by an unmarked vehicle. Officers climbed out quickly, assessing the situation as he waved them over. His words came out in bursts: the neighbor, the kennel, the hatch, the years of suspicion. The officers listened carefully, their expressions darkening as they followed him to the backyard. When they saw what he'd uncovered, everything shifted. Radios crackled. One officer called in for backup. Another secured the area with yellow tape. The quiet backyard was suddenly a crime scene. Ethan's father stepped back, watching as the officers examined the hatch, now half exposed in the dirt. They began working carefully to clear the rest of the debris. No one said it aloud, but every face reflected the same unspoken fear, that whatever lay beneath this rusted door was about to unravel a mystery that had haunted this neighborhood, and one grieving family, for far too long. The officers worked in a tense, methodical silence as they cleared away the remaining dirt and debris from the hatch. Every movement was careful, every breath measured. No one wanted to disturb potential evidence, but the urgency was thick in the air, it clung to their skin like humidity before a storm. Ethan's father stood a few steps away, fists clenched at his sides, his eyes locked on the hatch as if looking away would cause it to disappear. Part of him still couldn't believe this was happening. After 8 years of hopeless leads and sleepless nights, the moment he'd both dreamed of and feared was unfolding right before him. When the final layer of soil was brushed away, the outline of the hatch was fully visible. It wasn't just a piece of discarded metal, it was built with intention. A rusted handle protruded from the center, and faint scratch marks could be seen around the edges, as if someone had tried to open it from below. The realization sent a shiver down everyone's spine. One of the officers bent down, tested the handle. It groaned under the strain, the hinges stiff with age and neglect. 2 more officers joined in, and after a few tense seconds of effort, the hatch creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. A heavy, foul smell rose up instantly, a mix of mold, dampness, and something else no one dared to name. Flashlights were pulled out. One officer went down first, slowly, step by step, calling out that he was entering a confined underground space. The others followed, weapons drawn, beams of light slicing through the darkness. Ethan's father watched them disappear beneath the surface, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being was braced for what might be discovered. Minutes passed, long, dragging minutes that felt like hours. Then, a voice echoed up the stairs. Sharp, shaken. "We've got something." The words hit like a bolt of electricity. More officers descended. Someone called for a forensics team and a medical examiner. The tension outside the hatch thickened, and officers began gently ushering Ethan's father back, trying to keep the scene secure. But he refused to move too far. His legs were rooted to the ground, his eyes wide, waiting for confirmation, for anything. When the first officer re-emerged from the hatch, his face was pale, and his expression unreadable. Behind him, another carried up a small, tattered piece of cloth. It was dirty, decayed by time, but unmistakable, a child's shirt. Blue. Faded cartoon print barely visible on the front. Ethan's father's knees nearly gave out. He recognized it immediately. It had been one of Ethan's favorites, the one he'd worn the day he disappeared. The discovery of the shirt was just the beginning. Further down the tunnel, the officers found more signs: old toys, a pair of small shoes, and a mattress pushed against one wall. The space was cold and damp, a crude underground bunker, no more than 6 feet across. The walls were lined with insulation panels, as if someone had tried to muffle sound. And in the farthest corner of the chamber, a broken chain and rusted padlock were found, mounted into the concrete. The scene was horrifying. But more than that, it was real. Tangible proof that Ethan had been here. That he had been kept here. The implications hit everyone like a wave. This hadn't been an accident. This had been planned. Someone had built this, hidden it, used it, right under the community's nose. And for all those years, while the town mourned and the family suffered, the truth had been buried just a few feet below the neighbor's dog kennel. Ethan's father stood there, silent, tears running down his face. He didn't know yet whether his son had made it out of that dark place alive. But the truth he had chased for 8 long years, was finally clawing its way to the surface. The crime scene remained sealed off for days as forensic teams worked tirelessly to gather every shred of evidence from the underground bunker. Ethan's father watched from the perimeter, barely eating, barely sleeping, unwilling to leave until he knew everything. The discovery of his son's shirt and belongings had shattered what little hope he had clung to, but it also lit a new fire inside him, a need for answers, for justice, and, more than anything, for the truth to finally be spoken aloud. For too long, he had lived in a world where no one could tell him what happened to Ethan. Now, piece by piece, the silence was beginning to crack. Within 48 hours, police obtained a warrant to search the neighbor's home in full. What they uncovered inside confirmed everyone's worst fears. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement was a collection of disturbing items: surveillance photographs, worn-down children's toys, maps of the neighborhood, and journals filled with cryptic, obsessive writings. Some of the entries referenced the boy directly, describing in chilling detail the routines used to keep him hidden, quiet, and unseen. But what tore through the hearts of investigators and Ethan's family alike were the entries that hinted at escape attempts, punishment, and, finally, silence. Though no remains were initially found in the bunker itself, forensic teams expanded their search across the property. Days later, in a shallow grave not far from the hidden chamber, partial remains were recovered. DNA testing would soon confirm what Ethan's father already knew deep down: his son had been there, had suffered, and had died beneath the very ground he had walked past countless times. The man who had lived there, the quiet, solitary neighbor who always waved but never engaged, was arrested without incident. In his interrogation, he barely spoke, offering no explanation and showing no remorse. It later came out that he had a history of mental illness and had been previously questioned in a separate missing persons case decades earlier, but charges were never filed. Somehow, he had slipped through the cracks. And for 8 long years, he had hidden the unthinkable just steps from where Ethan had last been seen. News of the discovery broke nationwide. People were horrified, outraged, but they also mourned, not just for Ethan, but for the years that had been stolen from him, for the parents who had lived in agony, for a neighborhood that had unknowingly harbored such darkness. Candlelight vigils were held, old missing posters were replaced with memorials. And finally, Ethan's family could speak his name with certainty, no longer wondering if he was alive but grieving what had been done to him in silence. Ethan's father stood at the edge of the property one last time, staring at the place where the kennel once stood. There was no satisfaction, no relief, only a dull ache where hope had once lived. But there was also something else. A quiet pride. He had been right. He hadn't given up. And though the answers had come too late to save his son, he had given Ethan something that mattered deeply: the truth. He would never stop grieving. No parent could. But he had fulfilled the promise he had made every night for 8 years: I will find you. I will bring you home. And in a world that had long stopped searching, he had been the one who listened to the silence, who followed the quiet echo of love, and who uncovered what no one else dared to see.